We're dumber. We're number. More dumb, more numb. As it turns out, number isn't a word because it's spelled like number, which has many, many uses beyond just numbers, but number isn't one of them. Regardless, many would think number was a word, and that's because the numbers don't lie. We're checking out on learning earlier and earlier. We've spent 2 generations at least demonizing learning and celebrating stupidity. We've spent a century selling out to dollars and cents, a people for profit. Then we loaded up our buffet bowls with all the sweets and starches without any nourishment to fuel us. Over the last several episodes, I've been exploring the cult of demonization, dehumanization, and desensitization in our society. How did we get here? Ronald Reagan is the easy answer, since this episode is about him, but I don't like blaming just one person because it's rarely that simple. Reagan bulldozed the walls of the fortress, but in part 1 I told you about the 3 generals who stormed the castle with the aid of the tech advancements of one man and the legislative efforts of many. But it goes back way farther and much deeper if we're willing to. Deconstruct a culture of cultism to find out just what led so many lemmings off the cliff. In this episode, I'm breaking down Ronald Reagan and the playbook, his strategy to rise to supreme power and steer the course of global events in the 1970s and steal the 1980 election. With Ronnie, there's a lot to cover history and timeline-wise, so we're just going to stick to the points as they apply to paving the way for men like Rupert Murdoch, Vince McMahon, and Donald Trump to dominate their respective fields and manipulate our culture, normalizing all the wrong things while downshifting the course of America's collective emotional and academic intelligence. It didn't have to be this way. As you're about to find out, Ronald Reagan wasn't raised to be what he ended up being. In this episode, I'm deconstructing what led him from progressive parents and into the waiting arms of corporate cuckoldry. Murdoch, Trump, and McMahon, the unholiest of trinities, who, whether intentional or not, followed the work of Reagan to dismantle almost every protection we, the consumers, had against being exploited, manipulated, and used by, well, everyone who wanted to. These men manipulated their respective arenas of expertise, whipping up a frothing-at-the-mouth base of support and then feeding that support base the most toxic and problematic ideas of other people with no regard for the social or psychological consequences. It was all for profit, at the expense of we the people. We've been sold out left and right over the last half century. Well, I've covered all season long, it goes back farther, but just sticking to modern history. America's economy since Nixon has been crumbling toward failure. Despite the perceived successes in economic growth along the way, economies ebb and flow. They say war is good on the economy, which should be a warning sign. Number 1, that you're on the wrong path. But the Vietnam War certainly wasn't good for most Americans. Since Nixon, we've done very little to address the real issues Americans have faced. We've just addressed the issues that keep Americans at each other's throats. And that you can most certainly blame on Ronald Reagan. And welcome to the podcast. The American dream meant something before 1980 and not just dusty roads. Since then, America's prosperity and opportunities financially have dwindled down to a paycheck-to-paycheck, price gouging, gas guzzling, keeping your head above water, making a wave when you can economy. Turns out trickle-down economics meant America's working class would trickle down into poverty, which incidentally is where they want us, scratching and surviving without all the good times. Oh, our legislative leadership. Ain't we lucky we got them. Temporary layoffs, good times. Easy credit ripoffs, good times. Actually, it's more like permanent layoffs, jobs shipped overseas for profit at our expense, credit ripoffs, medical debt, Education debt? Again, thank one man. Like it or not, most Americans right now are broke and disenfranchised, but blaming all the wrong people. If we're fighting just to stay afloat, we can't paddle to safety on shore to build that raft to go save others. And we're always dependent on that life preserver we get thrown once in a blue moon. We're dependent on those crappy jobs and the crappy pay, and if we say the word union, we're unemployed. Now go choke on your $12 grande caramel frappe macchiato or whatever while you're at it. Imagine if we got paid enough money to save money, invest, start our own businesses, or just leave the crappy jobs we had and find our own path, whatever that may be. Well, that's the story for many Americans today, whether they like it or not, who can't find a suitable job for them or don't want to deal with the toxic, hostile work environments and low pay America's workplaces are known for. Pick an industry, pick a company. Chances are it's a shitty place to work for some. And for others, it's an opportunity for growth and advancement. But in most companies, most workplaces, industries, even that is the top 1% of the working class. Maybe 5% if we're being generous. But still, we're leaving a lot of worker bees flying around gathering the pollen without getting to taste any of that sweet honey. Give us a few decades of that, you'll end up with a hive of angry arthropods stinging one another to death until there's nothing left. Or just let humans kill all the bees, bygones. Trickle-down economics. It's the legacy of Ronald Reagan. However, just beyond catchy branding, this policy turned what was left of the American dream into an un-American debt nightmare. Our current economy, our current debt crisis, our current societal division, the rise of white supremacy, radicalized evangelical cult nationalism, actual real Nazis roaming the streets of America and not getting dropped where they stand. And of course, the reemergence of American fascism. For all of this, we must look to Ronald Reagan. It all started unassuming. Ronnie was just your average kid growing up in Illinois. His mother held a leadership role in their church, filling in for the pastor at times. Impressive for women back in the early 20th century. Naturally, Ron got involved in church pretty young. He saw his mother as a very spiritual person, a leader, a role model, along with his pastor, who, it said, influenced Ron's religious foundations. Ronnie's father held several jobs, but as a traveling salesman for most of Ron's formative years, it certainly left the boy with an absence that likely caused at least some level of trauma as a young man. A boy needs his father around, right? Isn't that what we're told? And John Edward Reagan would have been a good influence on the man who would become president. Jack Reagan was what many would have considered a progressive back then, a modern anti-fascist whose values clashed with racism and white supremacist ideals of that era. Jack's Catholicism is likely a source for his disdain of the Ku Klux Klan and firm stance against bigotry. But the fact that his O'Regan ancestors survived the British Empire, migrated to America, and Americanized their last name to assimilate better likely impacted Jack's socio-political ideologies as well. When one experiences oppression, it makes it that much harder to oppress others. Fox, lion, Aesop. Ronald Reagan's father, in his 57 years, stood for workers' rights, minimum wage, child labor laws, and more. After suffering a heart attack in 1941, John Edward Reagan died. According to Wikipedia, he may have made it if the ambulance that was closest would have been allowed to service that area. But, well, things aren't really all that much different today, are they, to be honest? So here's the multi-million-dollar question. With a mother whose devotion to the teachings of Jesus Christ, forming a love thy neighbor, do unto others, turn the other cheek, judge not, topple the temples foundation, and a father who reinforced those ideals with a sense of humanity and opposition to oppression of minorities, a sense of justice. How does Ronald Reagan exist? Ron was about 9 when his family moved to Dixon, Illinois, where he would go to high school. Now, academically, Ron wasn't anything spectacular. His interests were more aspirational than A's, B's, and C's. Ron was a dashing, handsome young man and charming as well. He found that football and drama were areas he could easily excel and not have to work too hard. His mother had done a little acting and likely influenced and encouraged Ron's interests. Ronald Reagan. He attended Eureka College, a private Christian school with his mother's blessing since it was a religious institution. It's entirely possible Ron wouldn't have been allowed to attend a non-secular school without some blowback from his very religious mother. Continuing his early passions of sports and acting, in college, Ron found a natural gift for politics and was named student body president. Again, Ron wasn't spectacular with books and learning. A scholar, he wasn't. An average student, academically speaking, in high school, and college wasn't a lot better. But through personality and popularity, Ron won over the small, meager student base. Ron had charisma. He didn't need to be academically gifted or even interested in that sort of thing. Learning was for other people. Ron was a leader in training. During his tenure, a strike by the students led to the president of the school resigning. While Eureka was a racially integrated school, at least by some standards of the time, Ron's hometown of Dixon wasn't very racially diverse. And for all the tolerance learned from his parents, Ronald Reagan's exposure to racism wouldn't come until later in his development, in college, his liberal indoctrination. His experiences with seeing others discriminated against led him to express similar anti-fascist and anti-racist sentiments as his father. His path after obtaining an economics and sociology degree was as a radio sports broadcaster for about 5 years before he had the opportunity to step in front of a camera, which led to Hollywood, Warner Brothers, and 30 movies before World War II. Reagan enlisted like many American men. However, the war disrupted the industry, entertainment, just like it did everything else, for years, during and after. Reagan, like many, wouldn't recapture the momentum once the world returned to normal. Ron acted, but unhappy with Warner Brothers and the kind of movies he was being offered, he worked out a deal to star for other studios as a freelance actor, which wasn't all that common for a man with the leading roles Ron had garnered. The studio employed him and put Ron in movies, but they also recognized the very limited box office draw Ronald Reagan was. He wasn't a great actor. He didn't have much talent beyond just being a star. So the studio didn't mind if he did other projects. Warner Brothers had good actors to rely on. Ron was just handsome and charming set dressing. This newfound free agency led Ronald Reagan to westerns and other projects, including the one he's probably most known for. No, not Newt Rockney. Now, that is why he's called the Gipper in his political campaigns later on. Ronald Reagan, who was upset about the roles Warner Brothers was bringing him, turned to Universal Studios for Bedtime for Bonzo. Ronald Reagan played a professor trying to teach a chimpanzee named Bonzo how to be more human. That film came out in 1951. His last film was in 1964. So not too shabby of a career for a mid-grade actor at best, spanning 3 decades and a total of 52 films. It's Hollywood. You don't have to be good to be successful, just good looking. Turns out, Ron was about as good of an actor as he was a student. He politicked his way through Hollywood, just like he did school, and he was named president of the Screen Actors Guild, twice. Now, before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's pause for a moment. World War II, like I said, everything was thrown into chaos globally. The film industry was no different. There's an old 80s B-movie, if you can find it, called Weekend Warriors. It is nostalgically terrible, but I love it. It's about the Hollywood National Guard and what happens when a bunch of actors, crew, makeup artists, costumers, and movie people get threatened with being called into active duty during the Korean War. It's a comedy. That film, it was one of my favorites for a while as a young man. It was campy and ridiculous, but it opened my mind to overthink the National Guard at that age. These are real people who are also soldiers? In a split second, they could get called to active duty. What happens to their jobs? For Hollywood, big money is spent producing these films. So when World War II broke out, just like those Hollywood types did in the Weekend Warriors movie, Reagan enlisted in the United States Army Reserve. As the movie explains, the Weekend Warriors were these wild and crazy Hollywood eccentrics who sort of had an unspoken understanding with their local congressman that they would be enlisted, but it was in nobody's best interest to call up that regiment. When hijinks ensued, the conflict of the story and their shenanigans got the Hollywood National Guard on the radar, well, then they had to put on a show and put up or shut up, prove that they were ready and worthy of being called up, while also showing that they shouldn't be. Ronald Reagan. I'm not saying anything about the National Guard or the Weekend Warriors out there who've served, but I've also known quite a few who don't do it for the service of it. Back then, with war looming in Europe and Asia, the men enlisted to serve if needed. And Ronald Reagan was needed. In 1941, he was called into active duty. Now, the issue was Ron was filming King's Row, so his agent and lawyer, Lou Wasserman, was able to defer Ron's drafting until after the film was finished, in 1941. By 1942, those deferments weren't for anything since King's Row was done, so the studio cut Ron loose because who wants to look like they employ draft dodgers, right? Reagan, the schmoozer, with all the charisma to take a C student to student body president, and a mediocre sports broadcaster to mediocre Hollywood stardom, reported for duty in San Francisco in 1942. However, apparently what nobody knew until then was that no, not bone spurs. Ron was severely nearsighted. Blind as a bat, I tell ya. Couldn't see to call a game. Couldn't read a cue card to save his life, apparently. Well, lucky for Ron, the military could still use him, if even not as a hero. Ron transferred to the Army Air Forces and became the AAF's public relations officer, then got a transfer back home to Los Angeles. Convenient, I tell ya. He would discharge in late 1945 with the rank of captain, having never seen a single moment of action. He did, however, put his mediocre acting to work producing hundreds of military training films. This experience is one that's notable. In the book Killing the President, Willard Oliver and Nancy Marion note that while in Hollywood serving as PR officer, Reagan became frustrated with the bureaucratic red tape involved with trying to, quote, remove a lazy or incompetent worker. Reagan, who never worked a day in his life, apparently struck issue with the work ethic of some of his fellow soldiers and found the institutional incompetence to be more annoying. For perspective, without poisoning the well, a man of meager academic ability and knowledge, but abundant in opinions and charisma, clashing with others, and then finding frustration in the structures in place to protect employees from unjustifiable termination, it doesn't always result in a compassionate outlook for the worker. But this clashes with Reagan's pro-labor parents and upbringing. Reagan, now full of all the arrogance, narcissism, and bravado that comes with being a star, began to see things differently than the humble ways he was raised. Rather than seeing the issues with the system and working to fix them, some blame the system and seek to dismantle it. Reagan chose the perspective, apparently, to see the harsh realities compared to the rose-colored naivete of his progressive parents. I might argue that this stems from a deep resentment and disrespect for his parents. Why else would he shrug off everything they taught him if he didn't look down on them and think he was better? This was probably the beginning of Ronald Reagan's ideas that bred his influence on our modern big government, small government debate. Reagan seeing ineptitude at our federal level, and then seeing wasted resources as a result, might have begun thinking less is more. Pull back some of those protections that enable a person to just sit around doing the bare minimum with no consequences. Maybe a little more studying might have taught Ronnie the big picture consequences of opening that door that, like me, swings both ways. Ronnie, who came from a pro-labor family, was quickly becoming a union buster. Politics going back to college was where Ron really excelled. Like I mentioned before, he participated in the student strike that got the head of the college to quit. Imagine what that does to a young man's ego. Reagan took those ambitions to Hollywood, presiding over the Actors Union, taking over the reins amidst labor disputes, and the rising Cold War fears. In this new role, Reagan's roots as a steward of the working class were overshadowed by an irrational, delusional paranoia and fear of communism. Ronald Reagan, a man who barely academically scraped through high school, barely got a bachelor's degree, then went on to sports broadcasting, then acting, thought he knew everything he needed to know about communism. Enough so that he threw away every value his parents taught him for the sake of this paranoia, fear, and mental illness. Ronald Reagan's mental illness, delusional paranoia, paired with his unrelenting narcissism and arrogance, was part of what led him to being instrumental in the blacklisting scandal of Hollywood. That was during his first stint as president of the Screen Actors Guild. He testified under oath before the House Un-American Activities Committee and during the FBI's investigation, turning names of his colleagues over as suspected communists. However, when pressured under oath, he only spoke of rumors and rumblings. Ronald Reagan never saw actual communism or communists in Hollywood or anywhere else, but he sure did turn people in for it. Hell, I'd honestly doubt Ronald Reagan even knew what communism was back then, but he carried that chip on his shoulder until his withered brain forgot what communism was. In fact, that paranoia led him to his second wife, Nancy Davis, who had become the first lady known for turning her back on the AIDS epidemic, like her husband. Nancy met Ron this same year actress Jane Wyman divorced him. She called the Screen Actors Guild president to clarify that she wasn't a communist. Apparently, old Ronnie threw Nancy Davis's name on the list. It was another Nancy Davis, right? I'm sure it was. Well, sparks flew and the rest is history. They married in 1952, the year after Bonzo came out. Ronald Reagan's early life was influenced by compassion, grace, progressive ideals. His experiences in college led him to stand against racism and other ideals he would later come to embrace. How did Ronald Reagan come to stand for economic and racial oppression, pyramid scheme economics, and establishing a nationalism that's festered into the growing fascism we see today? Just how Ronald Reagan turned into Ronald Reagan is anyone's guess. For my money, if you take someone of above average looks in a society that values that among the highest traits desired, and that person is largely unremarkable at any and everything they do except just being a star, then it's difficult to fend off the natural narcissism that breeds from that toxic stew. It isn't to say that all pretty people with mid-range talent are narcissists. I'm saying that despite being raised by parents who instilled in him the values of Jesus Christ's teachings, helping the poor, the working class, America's marginalized communities, Ronald Reagan became the antithesis of all that. Almost as if he were the communist all along, deflecting and projecting his fears onto others while he set the stage for a takeover. But that's just silly, isn't it? How? How did we get Reagan then? It likely happened in high school, when he found that he could excel at athletics and get by academically just for being on the team. Then, having his charisma and ego stroked in drama, he honed his charm skills, his powers of persuasion. He didn't have to work. He could just be and be successful. Popular, and popularity wins, Ronnie learned. You don't need ideas when everyone loves you. While probably unaware of the psychological storm brewing with that level of enabling, Ron probably didn't think anything of his ideas as they developed, because those hints of his parents' teachings would fade with time. When you respect someone, their teachings stick. Part of how Reagan became Reagan begins with the student government and extends into the military and Hollywood experiences that we've mentioned before. However, Ron's political experience wasn't just limited to college and the Actors Union. Until 1962, Ronald Reagan was a Democrat. If you remember back to the first part of this season when I pointed out that America First was a slogan used by Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, early in his career, loved FDR, heralded him as a true hero. This Union defector once fought against right-to-work legislation, would have participated in an anti-nuke rally in 1945, but Warner Brothers wouldn't let him for PR purposes. In the 1948 presidential election, this anti-nuke son of progressive parents would certainly have seen the appeal to Henry A. Wallace, FDR's third-term Veep, who was ousted from the ticket for being too progressive. As I've said before, Wallace's brand of progressivism and continuing the successful New Deal legislation that was way different than Truman's idea. Wallace had a vision of an America where the people had the power and the government worked for we, the people. Truman, the genocidal racist maniac who dropped the nukes, by today's standards would be a moderate, centrist, conservative-leaning Democrat. Joe Biden, hardly a liberal, which may be why Reagan supported him. Truman, for many, was a transition candidate, away from the FDR loyalists and back to sensible in-the-box thinking. An overcorrection from far left back to center. Remember, this was pre-1950. Race wasn't on the ballot in the way race issues are today. America just was racist. Even if some people weren't or were trying not to be, America institutionally had a long way to go. Following Truman's decision not to pursue another term in 1952, many of those Americans liked Ike and voted for the war hero, Eisenhower, including draft dodger and not-so-nearsighted hardly hero Ronald Reagan. This was a stark shift for the no-nonsense Democrat Reagan. In 1960, Reagan was backing Ike's vice president, riding the Nixon train, even though Kennedy would take that race. Ronald Reagan was still acting, by the way. In the 1950s and 60s, Reagan, who had always deemed himself too good for TV or theater, transitioned to television, hosting a few variety shows. One of those was MCA's General Electric Theater, which Ron started helming in 1954. During this time, Reagan was hired to speak at corporate events for General Electric as well. It was here that Darth Vader met his Emperor Palpatine. Lemuel Boulware was the vice president of labor at GE from the mid-1950s to 1961. Here, Boulware became a mentor to Reagan, influencing how Bonzo saw business and other people, grooming the Hollywood star for the kind of stardom that would trade in a red carpet for a White House. Boulware's legacy is something called Boulwareism, which is a take-it-or-leave-it style of negotiating and bargaining, one Boulware used to crush labor disputes over the years. Is there wiggle room? Nope. Well, then that's my final offer. Take it or leave it. In business, this isn't wise. It's contrary to a lot of the psychographic science of sales. Buyers want to feel like they're in control, so much so that they will often pay more if they feel like they're negotiating. Take it or leave it often leaves a negative taste in the buyer's mouth. In bigger, more important negotiations, like union disputes and political compromises, it's disastrous. In fact, the National Labor Relations Board found the practice violates the Wagner and the National Labor Relations Acts, both in place to protect workers' rights and unions. Boulware, like his Sith apprentice, had no time for silly things like unions or workers' rights. The reality is, Boulware's tactics were nothing short of fascist propaganda directed at bullying and strong-arming his employees to align with his political ideals. Those ideals were not FDR's New Deal legislation that was making America thrive and offering more and more opportunities to the American working class while offering those workers more and more protections from oppressive, greedy corporations who only care about bottom lines. This was Barry Goldwater's conservatism, and the kind that would lead to the George Wallace conservatism, and then Nixon, and then Reagan. Reagan, who was paid to speak to GE's employees for years, usually delivered charismatic speeches to the workers that were pro-business and anti-government. Anti-American government. Now, I'm just saying, if you're anti-American government and you're calling everyone communists, we'll come back to that, I'm sure, in this Create Your Own Conspiracy workshop. So here's movie star, TV star, and all-around star Ronald Reagan, who's telling all of GE's employees how great their bosses are and how horrible the government is and how bad unions are for their jobs. Then Boulware, who presented as anti-communist, illegally pressured and influenced, groomed his employees to vote for pro-business candidates with threats like we've all heard before. I'm the boss, and if I have to pay more taxes, I have to cut somewhere, right? That's illegal as hell. Reagan's speeches to GE employees got more and more issues-based, specifically critical of key legislation like Medicare, among others, while hailing business as the saviors of our economy. Why? Because government saved our asses with the New Deal when business tanked America's economy. America tanked thanks to business and might not have survived if FDR didn't piss a lot of people off by kicking the door in, metaphorically speaking, and issuing his take-it-or-leave-it legislation. So what's the difference between Boulware and FDR? Roosevelt went into the Capitol and immediately signed stacks and stacks and stacks of executive orders because America and Americans didn't have time to wait decades that it would take Washington to compromise with themselves. Boulware kicked the doors of the workers' break room in, busted up their unions, and started making rules that made it harder for the American working class to thrive. FDR said take it or leave it to the wealthy bigwigs and political power players. Boulware said take it or leave it to the little guy. Reagan once hailed FDR as an American hero, but would come to embrace the Boulwarism in Washington that nearly decimated our economy, cost countless lives in wars, conflicts, and pandemics, and nearly launched the dormant Cold War into a full-on global thermonuclear war. The kind of war games we didn't need, and the kind of Star Wars that should have been copyright infringement. In 1962, General Electric and Ronald Reagan professionally parted ways, and Reagan registered as a Republican, stating famously, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party, the party left me." Reagan would not part ways with his mentor, though. In 1962, 2 years before the Civil Rights Act was signed, Ronald Reagan left the Democratic Party, the party that would push and enact the Civil Rights Act. He would leave that party because, as he stated, the party no longer represented the values Ronald Reagan expected from them. Remember how I've said that the big switch never really happened the way we've been told? Here's a prime example. Reagan, the son of anti-racists, could no longer tolerate the party that was trying to turn the page on America's racially oppressive history. It isn't that simple, but it certainly becomes the gist in historical retrospect. George C. Wallace was the Alabama governor who would become the Grand Wizard of the Dixiecrats. He was a Democrat the year Reagan defected, but Wallace was a Southern Democrat. Reagan was an Illinois Democrat, then a California Democrat. What's the difference? Today, not much. Back then, a whole hell of a lot. That Mason-Dixon line meant something back then. From one perspective, one could argue that Reagan saw men like Wallace in the Democratic Party and was so off-put by their segregationist racism, he had no choice but to flip. But that would be confirmation bias. In fact, quite the opposite is likely true. The Kennedy era of the late 1950s to the mid-1960s is often forgotten for much of the civil unrest and social temperature, even though that civil unrest and social temperature cost President Kennedy and later Malcolm X, Dr. King, and Bobby Kennedy their lives. Many still don't think how volatile things were back then. In fact, the fairy tale nostalgia of Camelot overshadows much of the violent unrest of the early 60s. In 1964, following the assassination of Kennedy, Johnson felt he had no choice but to seek the nomination and continue the progress. After all, who was nipping on the party's heels but Wallace, who challenged the unelected incumbent Johnson for the nomination? Look, if it wasn't for the legendary racist Lyndon Baines Johnson, then it was going to be the still and until his death racist George Corley Wallace Jr. Johnson wanted to pass the Civil Rights Act. Wallace, among others, preferred things the way they were. Wallace wanted to make America great again, like it was in a century prior. The Democratic Party was splitting in two, with those Deep South Democrats clinging to the Jim Crow laws and segregation that kept them comfortable, while the rest of non-white supremacist America was fighting against those ideals. For the Republicans, race was a touchy subject. Conservative ideals then, just like today, valued power to the white elite middle to upper class at the expense of everyone else. In fact, conservative policy aside, conservative economics is pretty much socialism for the wealthy white elite at the expense of everyone else. We pay their salaries and bonuses. We fund their wealth. That level of wealth isn't earned, it's stolen from the working class. Ronald Reagan's switch to Republican, abandoning the humble and humanist ideals of his parents, was gradual. A modest man from a modest family from a modest Midwestern town hits it big, becomes rich and famous, and forgets everything he was taught. That sounds like the Cliff's Notes version of it. Who of us hasn't done that after all, right? When you add in the addictive power behind a young man forcing a college president to resign, then seeing what is perceived as weakness in the federal government that you, and you alone, can fix, and then slowly dismantling one's respect for workers and their rights, seeing more value in one's wealthy, powerful friends, and realizing that you now, too, are wealthy and powerful, and if you just keep it up, play your cards right, you'll be even wealthier and powerfulier. Then fold in the delusional paranoia of communism, so much so that you turn traitor on your fellow man, selling them up the river fed, blackballed, because a guy who barely passed college thinks he heard someone hear someone say someone might be a communist. Please, just imagine the arrogance of this man for a moment. The clinical, diagnosable narcissism, if anyone wanted to case study him posthumously. That's not a slam on Reagan. There's a level of ego, more id, but bravado, confidence, gravitas to do what he did, what I do. I'm an actor. I was a radio host like Reagan. I've hosted variety shows, and I battle narcissistic tendencies. I recognize some of mine, having been raised by and then later married to narcissists. I was able to do that through stoicism and careful deconstruction, aided by really good therapy. What I'm saying in this whole show is that we all exhibit narcissistic tendencies, not just actors, performers, social media influencers, politicians. All of us. You too. Because of Reagan. I'll get into that in the next episode, though, I promise. I believe narcissism to be a human quality, as natural as generosity and grace. A bit of it comes to us by instinct, but we have to be conditioned into that sort of thing. Practice it. In fact, I believe at our most foundational, primal levels, we're all a little more Negan than we are Rick. Most would end up Glenn's, but I didn't watch the last half of the show, so I'm not sure where to go from there. But what I'm seeing is a lot of Daryls mixed with Negans, except this ain't a zombie apocalypse. The world might be coming to an end, but we still have Netflix at this point, and the Daryls and the Negans, they're scary. They kind of are the Walking Dead. The walking tread. Don't tread on them. Seriously. They've been saying for years how far they'll go if you even set foot in their yard, remember? And why are we so outwardly open with our anger, hatred of others, bigotry, and alarming, bloodthirsty lust for any excuse to AKR-47s right up our neighbors' AR-15s? Reagan. Nixon may have crashed our economy and lurched America into a shitty credit score by taking us off the gold standard. But Reaganomics was just the lipstick on that pig. In 1964, just as TV was in color, a beloved star would step away from the television show that made him famous and set forth into Hollywood movie stardom, while another beloved star who had transitioned from film to television was entering his Hollywood swan song. Don Knotts hung up his empty revolver and laid his lone bullet on Ange's desk at the sheriff's office one last time in black and white, then dove into the deep, colorful waters of movie stardom as a talking fish, a conniving prospector, a hapless accountant, various other comedic film roles. Meanwhile, the man who was only funny alongside an ape, Ronald Reagan, took over the hosting reins of Death Valley Days, a series detailing the stories of the Old West. This would be his final acting role. By 1966, under the tutelage of Lemuel Boulware and others, Ronald Reagan decided to transition from mediocre acting to real politics. Reagan had big things planned, but first was governor of California. He stepped down from hosting the television show that continued his popularity and helped make him relevant following his dwindling film career to step into the limelight of the choose-your-own-adventure of public service and power brokering. After all, a man can't run for office and have his own television show now, can he? Put a post-it on that, it'll come back up in the next episode. Barry Goldwater is an important figure in this conservative turnaround during the 1960s, because his was a much further right ideology than the progressive Eisenhower, the last Republican to hold the presidency. Eisenhower continued Truman's continuation of the New Deal legislation. Now, while Ike dialed a lot of it back, he still wasn't afraid to use the power of the federal government for the people. It wasn't just catchy branding. There was a reason people liked Ike. What had transpired in America in the mid-20th century was the culmination of America's imperialism, economic recovery from the Depression, and social progress in areas of race, gender, and even homosexuality as we knew it back then. It might be hard to believe now, but even back then, going off to college, seeing the world, one had exposure to way more ideas than what resonated in their hometowns among the locals who didn't get out much. We fear what we don't know. Acquaintance lessens prejudice. Aesop? And in the 1950s, America was amid a Cold War, with post-World War II fears of spies, invasions, and memories of war still present in our minds. America had dropped the bomb. Certainly, we were either the biggest dogs on the planet, woof woof, or we were all waiting for the retribution to come. We were war criminals, after all. America did this really terrible thing against humanity, something that was one of those moral dilemmas that could make or break a civilization, I believe. America cheered. America celebrated. America got to writing our history books. Gone forever was the debate on should we or shouldn't we if we ever had that power. We just had that power and we did it. We did because we raced like mad to steal the technology and then the scientists who were developing it for Hitler. We wanted it first. Whomever holds the spear of destiny controls humanity's fate, after all. The wielder of the spear can rewrite the history of humankind, rewrite reality to their will. Or didn't you know your Aryan Christian mythology? Here's a brush up. While the historical spear was the relic that pierced the side of Christ to confirm his death on the cross, there's a myth that goes along with most holy relics. The spear, or holy lance, has great power. There's a reason this shit's always locked up and being sought by bad guys. Hitler had an obsession with the occult and harnessing supernatural power to achieve his maniacal goals. If Hitler had nuclear weapons, he would decide humanity's fate. He would control the world. He could rewrite the history of mankind. The spear is a metaphor, like most religious bullshit. This isn't Warehouse 13. Inanimate objects aren't just magical. But Hitler offed himself. And then, when we couldn't drop it on him and make a big to-do about it, We dropped it on 2 cities in Japan. Then America was like, wow, cool, everybody's coming home. War's over. Parade, parade. Hey, remember this guy? He drove a Jeep in the Philippines in that propaganda clip before the movie. Now he's running for president in his uniform, like Gary Cooper in Patton. I like Ike. I love America. One nation under God, unlike those godless Orthodox Christian Russian communists, and the home of the brave. Play ball and gamble on it. Then America gambled in Korea and lost. Then later Vietnam and lost. That wasn't all. Those were just the famous fracassees. But before Vietnam, patriotism in America was at an all-time high. By white people. We beat the worst bastard on the planet. America saved the world. We were heroes. In America. But most people didn't leave America or get a strong perspective on America from anything but America. Whether we liked it or not, America was becoming a patriotic propaganda state. Why? The same delusions Reagan fell prey to. The Red Scare. The fear of communism without knowing what communism actually was. Communism, as I've explained in previous episodes, is an economic structure. It's compared to America's capitalism more than America's democratic socialist republic, or whatever the hell we're calling ourselves these days. People feared a change in how we handle work and money, but didn't have the first idea what that meant. I'm not defending communism. I'm saying Americans weren't smart enough to know better. Reagan certainly wasn't. Business. That's what capitalism and communism are about. Government is tertiary. Now, socialism is a blend of the two, government and economic philosophy. Democratic socialism in a modern sense, a Western modern sense specifically, would be capitalism with a conscience. If this seems confusing, imagine how all that must have seemed to a bad actor who barely finished high school and barely got through college, and whose best known accomplishments were teaching a monkey how to dance and ratting out Hollywood to McCarthy's blacklist. Still, Reagan's mental illness, delusional and irrational paranoia of communism, something he couldn't have hoped to have understood, drove the man insane. Strong words, sure, but when you look at his history and how he started out humble with progressive parents who taught him anti-fascist, anti-racist, pro-labor values, and how he turned a sharp 180 to be fascist, racist, and pro-big business, one could conclude that for a dashingly handsome yet unremarkable young man with a little charisma finding that spotlight of acting and the adulation that goes with that, with the affectations of very impressed ladies stoking that ego like a blazing bonfire, humility is something one has to focus on, to work on. Throw in the power of influence of ousting the head of a school, all these moments that Reagan, were he a truly humble man, would have kept his massive ego in check. But Ronald Reagan wasn't a man who saw many consequences for his words or actions at any point in his life. Ronald Reagan, in fact, had become a bully to his co-workers, to his fellow soldiers, to his fellow actors, and to the fans who flocked to hear him speak. Ronald Reagan was on the verge of taking over the largest state in the Union, and then stepping onto the biggest bully pulpit to convince America to vote for him to make America great again. His original campaign slogan from 1980. How Ronald Reagan rose to power is fascinating. More fascinating is how he sold his soul to do it. How he turned his back on his parents, his mother, who he said always saw the best in people, and raised him a Protestant rather than a Catholic like his father. His father, who was a strong anti-fascist, anti-racist, and pro-labor influence. How Ronald Reagan couldn't see the best in people, Americans, and somehow along the way became trained and conditioned, groomed to see only the worst. The war on drugs, race relations, the AIDS epidemic, nuclear disarmament, Reaganomics, and so much more just didn't have to be the way it was at all, and almost wasn't. In fact, Had Ronald Reagan's mental illness, narcissism, and thirst for power not consumed him, had his parents' teachings and influence been the foundations of his ideology, then America would have had a president like Eisenhower, who would have been fiscally conservative but open-minded about the possibilities of progress for the people when we work together. One who wasn't afraid of the power of our federal government. We might have had a presidential candidate who might have actually made America great. For once. But ego, mental illness, narcissism, and a sociopathic thirst for power got in the way. That's what happens when we don't cultivate and curate humility, grace, and generosity in our everyday life. When we come to feel entitled and like everyone is beneath us, then we begin to act in a way that is only in our best interests. Selfish, self-serving. Had Reagan experienced some more personal humility early in life, had he experienced actual discrimination rather than growing up in a mostly white community, had Reagan been told, no, you just can't be handsome and charming, you have to be good at something, anything besides schmoozing. Had anyone told Reagan no? Imagine for a moment if Ronald Reagan fought for the racial justice his father insisted America was about. Imagine, if you would, Ronald Reagan, the bastion for women's rights, seeing how his mother was a strong role model. Just picture Ronald Reagan, the epitome of Christ's love, grace, and charity, just like his mother tried to teach him to be. Imagine if Ronald Reagan would have taken his academics as seriously as he did his popularity, if he read and studied and learned. If Ronald Reagan knew what communism actually was before ruining the lives of his fellow actors, accusing them of treason. As an actor, it makes me wonder just how much work that got him. After all, if you have your competition under investigation by the feds, maybe you'll get that starring role after all there, Bonzo, huh? What we do know is that Ronald Reagan, who ran for governor of California, did not run as a Democrat, and certainly not as a progressive. The farthest thing from it. What we know is that the party left him as the Democrats were desperately seeking to shed the white supremacist, racist shame of their past and move forward for the people, all the people. What seemed to happen is that Reagan jumped on the Klan wagon as those racists and white supremacist voters began fleeing the Democrats and converging into their own failed party, the Dixiecrats, before being welcomed with open arms into Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. The Dixiecrat movement didn't even last an entire election cycle before being absorbed exclusively into the Republican Party. If Lincoln's Republicans were the party that freed the slaves, Reagan's Republicans were the ones trying to slap the shackles back on. Yes, some Southern Democrats, like my father, lingered. But as I mentioned, and I'll cover later this season, that wasn't social or racial alignment. The Southern Democrats clung to the party because they were too broke to be Republicans. The party who only cared about corporations and big business. And society was still racist enough for them that they didn't have to pick a side based on race. Yet. Slowly, as the 70s, 80s, and 90s evolved, many of those Southern Democrats became disenfranchised with their evolving cultures, thanks largely to the rise of media technology. Many of these Southern Democrats were uncomfortable with the increasing insistence of diversity in America and the open-mindedness they were encouraged to embrace. Adding to that discomfort was the resentment at the absence of the perks they thought they would be getting by ignoring their racism for the sake of their bank accounts. The economy was trash following Nixon and the Vietnam War. There was no rebounding for Gerald Ford or America. The recession writing was on the wall. The best Ford could do was work with the governor of California, who had challenged him in the primary and lost. Work together to tank what was left of the economy for the sake of setting President Jimmy Carter up for one of the worst terms a president could have. Carter was a good man, which keeps him off many of the lists of worst in history. Plus, most historians recognize the deliberate stage that was set for Carter's failure, which would almost ensure Reagan's victory 4 years later. a similar strategy that was used in 2020. Still, when victory wasn't guaranteed, Reagan negotiated with terrorists behind the White House's back, while a candidate, not even president, and made a deal with Iran to free the hostages the day he was inaugurated. Those hostages had been held captive since November 4th, 1979, 444 days. Reagan did what Reagan did his entire life, whatever the fuck he wanted to do with no consequences. In this case, he committed treason against a sitting president, negotiating with terrorists for political clout. It worked in his favor, and that's the only reason he wasn't hanged. I want you to think about this for just a moment. 52 Americans were taken from our embassy in Iran in 1979. Ronald Reagan negotiated their freedom behind Carter's back while Carter, the president, was trying to negotiate to free them. Reagan undermined the sitting president, made America look weak so he would look strong. Narcissism, sociopathy, ego. But what we don't recognize is that he manipulated those hostages and Americans for a headline, history, a legacy, and media clout. Those hostages could have been freed when? But we know that they were freed on the day Reagan was inaugurated. Imagine the narcissism and ego involved in holding Americans hostage, which is what Ronald Reagan did. If Iran held them hostage since 1979, we the people should be asking just how long did Reagan hold them hostage? When could they have been released and brought home before Reagan said, hey, what if we held off and did it on the day I swear in? That'll look great. The man was an actor. Everything he did was for entertainment purposes only. Still, with sweeping tax reforms and economic strategies that sounded good on paper to anyone who couldn't do anything beyond basic math, the economy rebounded rather quickly and was good under Reagan. It slipped a little under Bush 1, thrived under Clinton, crashed under Bush 2, rebounded under Obama, continued that rebound for the first bit of Trump, then began to slip in 2019 and crashed hard in 2020, as the COVID pandemic swept the world. Economics ebb and flow, you know? Almost like for every great up we gotta have a down to balance it. And nobody's happy with a flat line. We gotta have the bad times to appreciate the good, right? Reaganomics wasn't just basic Econ 101. It was an elaborate pyramid scheme that convinced Americans they could succeed and would see the rewards if they worked really hard to help their bosses thrive. It was a strategy designed to annihilate unions, workers' rights, working class power, while delivering the illusion of prosperity. Until the bottom dropped out. Lipstick on this capitalist pig. Imagine someone says, hey, I'm throwing a party. It's a potluck. So everybody, work your butts off and bring 2 dishes. Actually, if you could and wouldn't mind, could you bring a few dishes? And maybe a dessert too. Don't take a day off work to cook for the party. Just do it when you get home from work. And wake up extra early the day of the party to finish all the fixins. Bring them early if you would, and our people will get everything set up. And when you get to the party later, well, there'll be so much food you won't know what to do with it. Everyone's taking home to-go boxes, and it's going to be amazing. Don't eat. Save your appetite. Well, let's be honest. Who could eat, right? You spend all your grocery money on the stuff you need for the dishes for the party, and who cares, right? You're bringing at least enough home to make up for it, right? Then, when you get to the party, the lights are off, the room's a wreck, the band's breaking down their stuff, and the buffet table is empty, with barely crumbs left to mash your finger into and just get a little taste of what was there for somebody. Or should have been there for us, and isn't anywhere to be found now. You're hungry. You haven't eaten since yesterday. You're exhausted because you've worked all week and then cooked all night and all morning. Reaganomics. It's dependent on the worst people on the planet not being complete greedy assholes, scheduling a fake party later than the real party, jamming out, clearing out the bar, stuffing their faces, and then taking everything, all the leftovers, all the surplus for themselves, to sit in their 4 refrigerators and rot for weeks before the maid finally throws it out. Reaganomics. Trickle-down economy. America's most successful pyramid scheme. Coming up, I'm wrapping up this Create Your Own Conspiracy series and this segment of Overthinking Everything with an episode that ties together Ronald Reagan, Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump, and Vince McMahon in explaining how in the hell America became so aggressive. We'll take a look at Reagan's run as California governor, recapping the late 60s to mid-70s to give us a clear picture of the socioeconomic evolution of the son of progressive parents, Ronald Reagan. We'll even go back to the 50s a little bit more and examine the big switch. Not America's, but Reagan's, to see more of his political shift right. In fact, I might argue the big switch had just as much to do with Ronald Reagan as it does the Civil Rights Act itself. I'm breaking down America in eras to explain what led us to the brink of fascism. I'll discuss more in depth the corruption that seeped into American politics and how Reagan initially fought that corruption only to fall prey to it in his quest for ultimate power. How 2 men in the mid-20th century, who were rivals ideologically, politically, and personally, came to find common ground. The most toxic, corrupt, and problematic common ground. That common ground became the foundation of Reagan's presidency, legacy, and the shit show America sees today. We'll find out more how the biggest crook of the 20th century led to the biggest scam in American economics. And even after all that, 75 million Americans still voted for the biggest crook we've ever seen in the White House. It's all about how America devolved as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my original music under my Sir Talks a Lot moniker, my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting and voiceover work. It's all organized in playlists for you. Check out my merch store at joshbrandonmedia.com. Get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. I got bumper stickers coming out now and more products coming soon. Follow me on TikTok. Everywhere you can find me online, like, share, and subscribe to this channel and do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. If you like this series, it's my full-time gig. Consider a donation to Cash App, and don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.